for joining us this evening, I should say. It's a real pleasure to be here and get to have this conversation with Amanda. What Jude did not mention is that Amanda and I go way back. We were in graduate school together, and so to start the conversation, this is a very different book than the book you were working on last time we spent time together. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book.
Sure, yes. So this book is about exploration, and it tells the stories of 10 overlooked or forgotten explorers whose discoveries changed the history of the United States. You can see, how's this? Yes, on the poster here you can see some of the men and women who are featured in the book. So they made incredible discoveries, like Matthew Henson, pictured, he's a little hidden, was the first person to reach the North Pole. We have Sacagawea, who is part of the core of discovery. James Beckworth, a mountain man who discovered Beckworth's Pass. So each figure in the book represents a different era in history. And so you not only get these 10 biographies, but you also, reading the book, kind of have a survey of U.S. history through exploration from the country's founding all the way through the space race.
The figures you described are in some ways very different from one another. I mean, it's an incredibly diverse range of people. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you selected the individuals you chose to write about.
Yes. So I wanted to pick 10 people and have the mix of names be mostly unfamiliar, but with a few familiar names whom you might not have thought of as being explorers. So someone like Amelia Earhart, I would argue that she was an explorer of air, pushing that new frontier, going farther and faster than people had ever done before. And someone like Sally Ride, when we think about space as a new frontier in the 20th century. So it's a mix of familiar and unfamiliar names, and each one, as I said before, kind of represents a different period in U.S. history. So you get a taste of the gold rush, the age of imperialism, the progressive era, polar exploration, and a whole swath of topics.
They do span such a range of American history from the earliest days of the United States to very recent history, which is I should congratulate you on a remarkable feat of writing to tie them all together. I wonder if as you were surveying these people, you identified or saw traits that you saw in common among them, things that kept coming back as you were researching and writing about their lives and experiences.
Yes, that's a great question. It wasn't something I necessarily thought about when I was researching the book, when I conceived of the book, but while researching I began to notice that there were particular traits that explorers had in common, and some of them might be obvious. You might think perseverance, resilience, just physical or mental toughness, but also a couple of the traits surprised me. So something like flexibility or adaptability. How does a person respond when something doesn't go their way? Can they change their objectives if things aren't turning out the way that they intend them to? So I can give you an example. Here is Jim Beckworth. He was a mountain man born into slavery in antebellum Virginia. He was biracial and emancipated by his father as a child. His father moved the family to St. Louis, Missouri, which was the gateway to the West. And Beckworth wanted to find more freedom and mobility on the western frontier, so that's how he became a mountain man. So he was just a really creative entrepreneurial figure, and he was all over the United States at the most exciting times. And he just happened to be in California, for instance, when the gold rush began. So he makes his way up and gets to those gold fields, but he sees all these people, right, rushing to find gold, and he is so clever, and he thinks to himself, that's not the way to get rich quickly. The way to make some money is by selling goods to all of these people who are coming. And so he quickly, changes his goal and starts doing that. And then again, he's prospecting one day, and he's not really thinking about the gold. Instead, he sees a pass in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, and he thinks to himself, gosh, that pass is really low, and if settlers could use that pass, they could make their way more easily into California. So so he raises money for this pass, and he builds this road, and he leaves the first wagon train right into California. So he's an example of an explorer with that trait of, flexibility, adaptability, and thinking about how to change his goals as he's out there in the world.
There are certainly commonalities that show up in the characters in this book. But you also show an evolving study of what it means to be an explorer, what it looks like to explore. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the evolution of American exploration looks like.
Sure, yes. Well, first off, I wanted to define exploration broadly in the book. So we have land, we have air, and we have space, and I think you could go even bigger than that. But one thing I noticed, and it's not true, I think, for every person who is exploring in every different period, but I'm kind of showing the arc of change in the book. The earliest explorers are thinking about the acquisition of land and maybe the exploitation of the land. So someone like Beckworth or people of his era thinking about the gold rush and getting minerals and that sort of thing. Laura Ingalls Wilder's chapter talks about homesteading and using land for farming. But by the time you get to the late 1800s, you have a figure like John Muir. And so he immigrated from Scotland, and I know that you're familiar with the story. He explores for the purposes of conservation. So we see a shift, I think, as the frontier begins to be closed, and so much land is being exploited and the environment's being harmed. Indigenous people have been violently displaced. And I think there's a shift in the mentality of some people towards conservation. Another figure in the book is a woman named Florence Marion Bailey. She was a Gilded Age ornithologist, and she explored to save birds who were being slaughtered in the name of fashion in that period. So I won't tell you all the objectives of all the explorers, but there's definitely, that's one thing we see is that shift from the acquisition of land to conservation, and then also I think the acquisition of knowledge becomes a goal more so in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's something that comes through really clearly in the book is exploration not just as sort of an act of physical endurance, but as an intellectual process.
Yes.
That was something that I found very interesting, particularly in reading the book. As we mentioned, your first book was a comparative study, right? A comparative study of Russia and the United States and their responses to emancipation. So I guess I'm wondering, we're looking at 10 American explorers here. And I wonder if you thought, if in writing this book, you thought at all about the question of, is there something inherently American about exploration, or is there something maybe particular about the ways that Americans do exploration compared to how other people do?
Those are both great questions, and I think I have slightly different answers to each of them. And I'm curious your thoughts about that as well. To what extent is exploration a uniquely American activity? I don't think it's exclusive to America, but I do think what's interesting is that across almost 200 years, you see people of all different backgrounds looking at the country in a way, looking for freedom personally, freedom from maybe discrimination or sexism or economic circumstances that are holding them back, and they look to what they think of as new frontiers, be these frontiers actual, land frontiers in the West, or later on, right, the air for someone like Amelia Earhart, space for someone like Sally Ride. So I think you could make an argument that the existence of a frontier in America's history possibly has contributed to that kind of openness and seeking that is common among the individuals. And then your second question, can you remind me again?
Is something unique in the way that Americans
Yes.
explore, perhaps?
Yes, I do think that technology plays a really big role, especially in the 20th century, for exploration. I think America, because of its economic and political system, is a really innovative country, and technologies and the invention of new technologies and the harnessing of those technologies really power exploration. For instance, you've got a man like Matthew Henson, who is part of Robert Peary's expedition to the North Pole. And in 1908 to 1909, they take their ship and they spend the winter in Greenland, and then they've got to take their dog sleds and get all the way to the North Pole and come back. And the whole Arctic expedition takes a year. Just a decade later or so, you have airplanes, and new technologies in airplanes are the North Pole and the South Pole. And so you see that again with Amelia Earhart going all around the world, testing how far and how fast those airplanes can go. And then I think, of course, with the space race, using rocket power to reach new regions as well. So I think technology plays an important role, and I do think that innovation is an important American.
I wonder also, this is, I think in some ways a follow-up question to that. You're also someone who's worked on the importance of presentation, right? And how people and different archetypes are depicted in media, visual media, print media, things like that.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could comment on especially you start the book with Daniel Boone, right? And the way that Daniel Boone looms large in American folklore, in the American mind. And in some ways, this is very much not a book about Daniel Boone, right? But there's a reason Daniel Boone looms so large. And so I could wonder if you could talk a bit about, the role that explorers play in the American folklore, right? For lack of a better word, maybe there is a better word. Memory. And then how you see your book interacting with that.
That's a good question. Yeah. So I think Daniel Boone is one of the most common explorers that might loom large in our imagination when we're thinking about who America's most well-known explorers were. And I think there's also a question that comes up with why do we remember Daniel Boone so much, or even figures I think where there is a lot of myth around them, like a Sacagawea type figure, and then separating back from myth and that kind of thing. But someone like Boone, right? He writes his autobiographies written in his own lifetime, and it becomes a bestseller in Europe, and then afterward, there's just this kind of cult of Daniel Boone that develops with the mass marketing of his face, and the coonskin cap, which isn't even something that he would have worn, actually. But so he becomes that kind of like mythological figure in American memory. So I think that, many of these explorers don't have the same kind of mythical legacy as Boone, but that doesn't mean their accomplishments weren't just as important, if not more so. And so that's something that you can decide for yourselves reading the book.
Well, there's something to be said there about self-promotion, right?
Definitely.
As well. And I was struck, particularly in the chapter about Matthew Henson and the way Henson, as an African American, was represented in turn of the century media.
Yes.
So I think in some ways your book is a really useful corrective about some of the ways narratives have been presented about American exploration.
Just for context on Henson, so Robert is referring to the fact that after he and Robert Peary and the 4 Inuit men on their expedition reached the North Pole, or at least got as close as they could using the instruments of the day, when they got back, Robert Peary, who was the white commander of the expedition, he got all the glory. And so the white-owned newspapers, really downplayed Henson's role, when really he had actually most likely been the first person to set foot on the North Pole. He was fluent in the Inuit language. He knew how to build dog sleds. I mean, he was just, the expedition couldn't have happened without him. And yet, for so many decades, his role was overlooked. And it's only been in recent years that he's been given the credit that is due.
The book is about 10 explorers. But I'm sure, as we all know, there are many more who aren't in this book. So I wonder if there was anyone who was sort of the last cut. As you were determining who to zero in on, who to talk about in this book, were there people whose stories you really wanted to tell, but for one reason or another couldn't?
Yes, so there were 2 people who were originally on the list who did not make the cut. And I'll tell you who they were, but I'm sure there are many people beyond these 2 individuals. So one person who didn't make the cut was Elizabeth Cochran, more popularly known as Nellie Bly. She was that progressive era journalist who raced around the world in 72 days, I think, inspired by Jules Verne's book. So she was originally going to kind of represent the progressive era and that role of technology, railroads and steamships, and helping you around the world. But when I heard William Shepard's story in a sermon that my minister gave back in New York, I thought, oh my gosh, this figure is so compelling. So I substituted William Shepard in the place of Nellie Bly. And I don't think I mentioned Shepard yet, but I'll quickly say he was the first African-American missionary to reach the Belgian, to be in the Belgian Congo. And he basically uncovers King Leopold II's atrocities against the Congolese people. So he explores in the service of activism, and it's a very remarkable and unusual story. So his story went in. And then the other change we made was swapping Neil Armstrong for Sally Ride, because you all know about Neil Armstrong, even though his story is, I think, so compelling, and so the racism is remarkable. But Sally Ride's a little less known, so I wanted to talk about her instead.
I wonder, in a similar vein, who did you find most interesting to research in this book? Or sort of, as you were writing this, where as authors we're not supposed to have favorites, and the parts of the books that we write are the people that we write about. But I'm curious if there were if there was any person you found just sort of most compelling to write about or to learn about in the first place.
Okay, great question. It's hard to choose favorites. No, my favorite chapter is the North Pole chapter about Matthew Henson. I think he was a really courageous figure who overcame lots of obstacles during the Jim Crow era. There are also a lot of fascinating sources that are available to use to be able to tell his story. So if you go to Morgan State University, you can see the sealskin gloves that he wore. If you go to the Explorers Club in New York, you can see one of the sledges that they took. At Morgan State, there are also, he's got the pictures that he took on the exhibition, and the speeches, the notes for the speeches that he gave afterward. He also has a published autobiography, so if any of those things interest you, I encourage you to check them out. He was really a remarkable figure.
Yeah, and that speaks, I think, to a couple of, there's lots of things we could talk about with Matthew Henson, right? One of which I think is, we talked sort of about a changing relationship with space, right? And the frontier as a driver of American exploration. But you mentioned William Shepard, you mentioned Matthew Henson, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about exploration and the different ways that American explorers have related to the people that they've encountered.
Yes, that depends on the person, and it depends on the period, I think. So I'm just thinking of examples. So one really interesting commonality between the three African American explorers in the book, Jim Beckworth, William Shepard, and Matthew Henson, is that all three of them learned the languages of the indigenous people whom they lived with for periods of time, and adapted their ways of living in a way that helped them succeed as explorers. And that's not I would say, typical approach of many explorers. For instance, Lewis and Clark were not doing that during the Coral Discovery mission. Harriet Chalmers Adams, who's featured here, she travels all throughout South America, and she takes on the role kind of observer of the different indigenous peoples of South America. She takes photographs, she writes about them for National Geographic, but she's not adapting their way of living so much to survive. And Beckworth, Shepard, and Henson all did do that, and I think that's an interesting commonality.
Yeah, sort of adaptation versus encounter and exploitation. I think
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a really interesting through line that runs through the book. I want to make sure we leave time for the audience to ask questions. But while you're thinking of them, one question that struck me is if someone is writing a different version of this book 20 or 30 years from now, I wonder if you see trends evolving, especially in the sort of the latter chapters and latter decades about American exploration, that might point to what kind of figures, the person who's writing the updated version of this book in 30 years, or if you're writing the updated version of this book in 30 years, right? What might we expect to see included in a history of American exploration, several decades from now?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question, and it makes me wonder what kinds of exploration there will be and how that will be made possible. And so one of the interesting trends I think we see today that probably will persist is kind of the role of institutions in funding expeditions, because expeditions are so expensive. And so I'm thinking about the Explorers Club in New York again, where many of these figures actually, they had a relationship or were members, several of them. But the Explorers Club today has people from all around the world who are doing deep ocean research, people who are going into space, people who are in rainforest candies, every kind of exploration you can think of. But it's so expensive to travel and do scientific research, and so I feel like people are going to keep needing institutional support to do that, or they'll be the billionaires who can, send themselves to space because they can. So it makes me wonder to what extent, you'll have like the curious individual who's making the discoveries versus larger backed expeditions. So that might be something that we see 30 years from now that's different from the past.
Yeah. Well, with that, I sort of turn it over to the audience and see what questions you have for Amanda.
Please, yes.
So I'm a fellow historian here, and I find it a bit inspirational. I wanted to ask, sort of in the process of writing, did you feel you ever had to like sort of fight against this sort of internalized, pedantic voice like nagging in your head saying like, well, you've been trained in, sort of 19th century history. It's like you need to stay in this like little narrow bracket. I'm just sort of like interested in, I guess like, was it any sort of struggle for you to say it's like I'm going to write like broad sweeping history?
I mean, it was definitely, I think, deciding to make it beyond the 19th century, to start earlier than my period that I wrote about in my first book, and to end later than the period, again, that I was trained in. Definitely, I knew I was going to have to stretch myself as a scholar and to read beyond what I was familiar with. And also and one thing I did with this book was also, of course, to talk with people who are experts in these periods, and to have them do a kind of a peer review of the different chapters. I think the more you know, the more you know you don't know. And making sure, drawing on the knowledge of other people helped me in the writing of the book. Yeah.
And then I have another question. I was super intrigued to find out that you also worked on Russia. Because I kind of feel like Russia has like this weirdly sort of like parallel experience of like continually, sort of redefining their border to be just a little bit bigger than it was. And it's like there's almost this like manifest destiny of like we're just going to get it all the way to the end of the continent. And so I'm wondering, was there any concept of a frontier, or have you seen?
Definitely, yes. So my first book was about American slavery and Russian serfdom. So I have a background in Russian history as well, and it was fun to be able to weave in a little bit of Russian history in the space race for this book. But definitely, Russia thought of itself, I think, as an empire, and they also expanded their borders by force and absorbed people with all kinds of different ethnographic backgrounds and traditions. Ethnographic traditions and things, and that is something that I think Russia still like grapples with today. What does it mean to be a Russian person, and how do they sort of conceive of themselves as a diverse nation made up of often different people? So yes, I think there are some parallels, and some interesting work being done by scholars on that topic. Yeah, about empire and expansion. Please, yes.
Do you think William Shepard's work had a lot of influence on Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost?
Yes, he does. He does write about William Shepard in the book, and I think that's a fantastic book if you want to learn the full story of all the things that were happening in the Congo under the Belgian King Leopold II. Great book. Any other questions, either about any of the different individual explorers, or if anyone's here is a writer, any questions about writing or process, I'm happy to answer anything.
I have a question, a broader question, I guess. Can you say anything about why you wrote this book at this particular time?
Sure. Yes. I wanted to write a book. Well, I think exploration is a complicated topic. Some people benefit from exploration. Oftentimes there are negative consequences for other people. But I think this idea of discovery and the drive to uncover new things is something that is exciting and something that maybe we as Americans could feel good about. And to see how it's kind of manifested in different ways throughout history, that drive to discover. So I wanted to write a book about that. Yeah.
Can I ask a similar related question? You mentioned, I think it might be in the acknowledgments, which are always my favorite part of the book, that you went to a great many of the places that people in the book visited, and I'm assuming that doesn't include space in the North Pole.
It's out of the North Pole, yeah.
But given, I'm curious if there were any places that you went that you found sort of particularly moving or evocative or useful for you in conceiving of the experience of the person you were writing about.
definitely. That's a fun question to answer because it brings back lots of memories from the trip. So I took a 2-week road trip in the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery. And so I went from St. Louis, Missouri to Astoria, Oregon, and I'll just never forget that journey because I was, here I am reading the journals and seeing through their eyes as they're going and seeing these places for the first time, and I'm seeing many of these places for the first time. I crossed off my 50th date on the journey, but I think it was really amazing to try to be in the same sites where they were, and then to see how much had changed since they were there. I mean, so much more development in many cases, but also some places that may have looked not too dissimilar to when they were there. So that east to west journey. So many people have done it previously, and it was really fun to be able to do it on my own to think about how their experiences differed from mine. Yeah.
So were you going, following the journals and covering as much distance as they covered in one day?
No, I only had a shorter time frame.
Okay.
I had 3 kids at home, so I couldn't be gone for too long. And I was also in a car and not on the river on the boat. But if people are interested in doing that journey, there are so many well-preserved sites, and there's even a map. The National Park Service has a map, and you can look all over the country, and they just really, the records are amazing because the journals are so detailed. So anyone who wants to replicate that and do much more, you can do that. I think it'd be fun. Yeah.
Was there any other source of Sacagawea's story besides that?
Great question. The main sources about Sacagawea are from those journals. There are a few letters that Clark wrote about her after the journey. And there are also some oral histories that some of the tribes have that offer, competing accounts as well, that some of which have been published that you could look at if you're interested. And there's still debate about certain aspects of her life. For instance, in what year she died, where's the place of her burial. People have different opinions about that by a manner of decades. And all across the country, was it Wyoming, was it South Dakota? So I talk a little bit about that in her chapter and give you my conclusion about what I think really happened. Yeah. She's a really compelling figure and lived a remarkable life.
Any other questions? All right, well, please join me in thanking Amanda for being here with us this evening. There are books for purchase at the counter, and I will be signing as well.